he was a very humble person, and he didn't give journalists hard time. He was always available to give us his views. I remember the last time I was in Zambia during the elections, we were able to speak to him, and he was available, and he was confident that Zambia will recover from the economic challenges the country was facing. And he was also confident that on the continent, the leadership will continue to work hard to change the lives of the citizens of the continent. But unfortunately, as you can see, we have kind of regressed right now. We're talking about removal of government by military. As you heard from Ntate Mavuso saying that he didn't support the removal of government by power. And therefore, I think he could have been very disappointed with the recent reports around different countries where military was involved in removing sitting heads of state. But also, you'd recall when Zimbabwe was up in arms, and that led to the president then, or former President Robert Mugabe, leaving office. He went to Zimbabwe to go and persuade former President Robert Mugabe to just retire with dignity, because he didn't want to see a situation where President Mugabe was humiliated, if one can say that. But also, yes, a very close friend of former President Nelson Mandela. He used to visit South Africa a lot, and he would then interact with former President Nelson Mandela, and they will talk about their olden days in terms of fighting for the liberation of the continent. And as I indicated earlier on, he didn't only fight for countries in the southern region, but the continent in general. Him and the former president of Tanzania, Mwalimu Nyerere, the former leader of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, and of course the former president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, and OR, who was in exile.
All right, we've been getting various reactions from various quarters, and we'll continue to do that on the passing of former Zambian president, the founding father of Zambia's democratic order. He's often called Kenneth Kaunda, and he would have touched many hearts, many organizations, especially in terms of his teaching. Solima Paila joins us now to talk to us about his own memories, including that of the SACP. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, and good evening to our listeners.
So share with us how you as a party have received this news. What are your thoughts about his legacy?
Firstly, let's extend our heartfelt condolences to his family and to the Zambian people, and to all African liberation heroes and heroines who were inspired by his great efforts to liberate the African continent. This is quite indeed sad news, because Babu Kaunda was a towering stalwart of our liberation heroes in Africa and played a very important role, especially for the liberation of South Africa and the SADC region as a whole, and he led the frontline state quite cohesively against the apartheid regime. So we are really saddened by his sudden demise.
And just in terms of the role that he would have played, if we look at contemporary Southern African politics, obviously if we look at Rhodesia and South Africa, the relationship that, or the joint histories, just share with us from an SACP perspective what you believe some of his greatest teachings or contributions were to us finding ourselves where we are on this path to democratization.
Well, firstly, you know that Zambia played a host to several liberation organizations, including the ANC, ZANU-PF, ZAPU, and other organizations that were both in Tanzania and Zambia, but particularly our headquarters at some point as the ANC were settled in Zambia, and it provided us with absolute resources for our comrades. He even provided what in South Africa we'll call RTP houses for our people there to make sure that the ANC and other liberation forces were able to execute the liberation struggle from a safe environment. So he played a very prominent role and also looked after our top leaders, including President Oliver Tambo, to make sure that his issues were attended to urgently all the time. But he was a bedrock for the rest of the liberation forces. SWAPO, for instance, took refuge in Zambia as well, and he supported that movement quite strongly in Namibia. Everywhere else in the SADC region, but also on the African continent. So he played an extremely critical role and remained a counselor to many leaders on the continent. And also he remained a bit of example about how he left office, such a hero of our movement. When he was removed through democratic elections in Zambia, he acceded to the demands of the people and continued to provide counsel, and the people continued to see him as the father figure of Zambian liberation and, of course, a symbol of liberation fighters. I think he represented a special generation of our liberation heroes on the African continent.
The SACP's Solima Paila speaking to us there in reaction to news about the passing of former Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda. We speak to another former AC minister and AC stalwart, Mr. Paulo Jordan. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Let's talk about some of the philosophies that we've been talking about. Kenneth Kaunda, he's been said to have created what has been termed as Zambian humanism, but put at the forefront of liberation values and principles such as education and non-violent resistance, including hard work. Mr. Jordan, are you still with us?
Hello?
Hi. So we'd like to get your reaction on the passing of Kenneth Kaunda and some of the values, principles that he stood for.
Well, Kenneth Kaunda is one of the outstanding figures of the movement for African freedom and independence. He's one of a generation who brought about the independence movement, which gathered speed during the late 1950s and the early 60s. Kaunda wanted to place before the Zambian people what he felt was a philosophy to guide their movement and the country during its independence, and he used to refer to this as humanism, which he distinguished from capitalism and from communism, but which he said embraced certain socialist principles. I think one of the reasons why he put forward this was to have, I suppose, what one should call a unifying ideology for his nation. We must always remember that the borders of African countries were not drawn by Africans. They were drawn by imperialist powers and usually threw together communities that had formerly been unrelated by culture, by language, by ethnicity. And as a result, you had to find something to bring all these people together. Usually the struggle for independence was sufficient to bring about that national purpose. But having attained independence, you need something more. And I think Kenneth Kaunda saw his ideology of humanism as such an instrument.
And how was he able to inculcate that within his own political career, considering the fact that he started off as an organizer and then quickly rose up through the ranks through the anti-colonial freedom struggle? How did you think he brought these qualities to the UNIP or UNIP?
Well, he wasn't actually able to do it until he became the leader of UNIP. I'm sure he would, if you had asked him during his lifetime, he would have said, I fought for these ideas as these ideals right through my political career. But humanism was adopted as the ideology of the United Independence Party in Zambia after independence and after the ascendancy of Kenneth Kaunda. It was done in the usual manner through the branches of UNIP, obviously, and then also various instruments of publicity, publication, information. The newspapers in Zambia used to try to promote it. The national broadcasting system tried to promote it. And, there were many, many pamphlets, other publications that were produced trying to promote it. There was also the Institute up in Kabwe, which tried to promote it. How successful these efforts were remains to be seen, but there were these efforts trying to promote the ideology of humanism.
And if I can just very quickly, because I know this is something that you yourself would have spoken about at some point, just the communal approach to development programs. Are there still vestiges of this in some of the political programs, the philosophies that his former home practiced?
Are there remnants of it now?
Yes.
I wouldn't be certain. I haven't been in Zambia now, I think, probably since we got our freedom. So I'm not sure what remnants they are. But I would say that during Kenneth Kaunda's presidency, there were real attempts to try to translate that into reality. One of the difficulties Zambia faced was that its geographical position made it and compelled it to accept the role of a host country to all the movements in Southern Africa fighting for liberation, all those that were compelled to take up arms. If you look at the position, geographical position of Zambia, you've got Angola to its west, you've got Namibia to its southwest, you've got Zimbabwe immediately south, and then south of that, South Africa. To its east, you have Mozambique. Now, all these countries had to fight for the independence, and Kenneth Kaunda Zambia played host to all these liberation movements, which meant, of course, pressure on their own national resources. But over and above that, it meant pressure from all the states that were supporting racist South Africa and Portuguese colonialism.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, sharing your thoughts, your insights, and of course your experiences of the philosophies and work of Kenneth Kaunda, who is the former president of Zambia. Of course, so we'll continue our conversation with SABC international editor Sophie Mukwena. Let's get more reaction. We'll be speaking now to the EFF's Floyd Shivambo. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So you, I know, are some of the parties who have often gone back and forth, particularly the EFF, to learn from the teachings of Kenneth Kaunda when looking at how to approach development on the continent, including the political trajectory.
Good evening, Tsepiso, and evening to the viewers of SABC. We, as the EFF, are sending our deepest condolences on the passing away of the doyen of freedom fighting in the entire continent, Dr. Kenneth Kaunda. He played a very important role, and we always cherish and celebrate that he sacrificed the little resources that Zambia had to accommodate liberation movements, particularly in the Southern African part of the continent. Like Frelimo was housed in Zambia, SWAPO was housed in Zambia, the ANC was housed in Zambia, and a variety of other liberation movements. Despite the difficulties that a new nation which he was leading from 1964 was facing, he was able to sacrifice the little resources that Zambia had at its disposal to support the liberation, the total political liberation of the entire African continent. And that is a commendable feature because solidarity is what should define all Africans in the continent. So what we learned from Dr. Kenneth Kaunda was the fact that he accommodated and supported the liberation struggle in all parts of the African continent. But also, he was among the first of leaders who had declared themselves God presidents in different parts of the continent to hand over power through a democratic means. When he lost elections in 1991, he did not force to stay in power. He did not try to destabilize the new government. He handed over power to a democratically elected government and started a new era where governments could change power without any violence, without any coup d'etat happening. So Dr. Kenneth Kaunda is a very important figure in the struggle for total liberation in the entire African continent, and we will continue to celebrate him as the economic freedom fighter.
One of the things that you celebrated him for in your birthday message to him last year was the role that he played in education, which was also, as I mentioned, at the center of his philosophies for liberation. You said Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, when he took over, the Northern Rhodesia had only produced something like 100 university graduates, but he did the impossible thereafter.
Yes, that is one of the biggest contributions that Dr. KK made in the liberation of Zambians. So he understood that you cannot separate liberation from education. That is why part of his priorities was to intensify the provision of quality education to all Zambians, to people who otherwise were excluded by the colonial government. So he played a very important role in terms of educating his nation because he understood that in the world that he was leading, he needed as many people as possible who have got certified education to understand the dynamics of the world, or to understand how to develop their own communities without difficulties. So he has played a very important role, but also the education which Zambia was providing was not just for Zambians. There are so many people who went to the University of Zambia, so many professors here in South Africa had relationship with the University of Zambia. Professor Magubane from South Africa, he played a role in the University of Zambia because it was it was a home for all Africans, for all freedom fighters. Everyone else who went to Zambia felt at home. And that legacy is still there in Zambia. You will never have incidents of xenophobia in Zambia. Everyone else is welcomed in Zambia. They accommodate all Africans and appreciate that we are one people as the African people in the entire continent.
Just before I let you go, Mr. Shivambu, one of the principles that you also laud that Dr. Kaunda managed to materialize in the politics of Zambia was centralized economic planning. Tell us why this is important for you as a party and what role you see it playing in the developmental goals and agendas of this country.
Look, one of the fair diagnoses of the problems of the African continent was the wrongful adoption of free market economics in many parts of the continent. And majority of those approaches were imposed through structural adjustment programs of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to say that just allow the private sector to play a role in development. And that has been a dismal failure. That is why the African continent is still in a state of underdevelopment. But when a state takes charge of the economy and centrally plans it, guides where resources must be allocated, there is beneficial consequences of that. We don't have to go very far. Like if you check the fastest growing economies in the world in the past 30 years are those that have centrally planned economies such as China, like Singapore, and a variety of other countries that got developed much faster. So Dr. KK understood that far much earlier. And then, of course, later on was bullied by the World Bank and the IMF into adopting free market economic principles, which have ruined the economy of Zambia. They've experienced a lot of problems in terms of tax avoidance as well, particularly in the copper space, in terms of what happens. And you will know that the role of Anglo-American in terms of destabilization of Zambia it's well recorded in the manner that it is. But he always understood that this is what should be dealt with differently. And we salute him for that he stuck to principles. He was not swayed by populism. He was not swayed by wrong politics. He always stood his ground on what has to be done and what is to be done. And that is what we must always celebrate him for. And you will know that even, by the way, the earlier negotiations between the apartheid system in South Africa and the liberation movement were initiated and presided over by Dr. KK, and he has played a very important role, and we'll always celebrate and salute him for having played a role. So there's no time to mourn Dr. KK. We must celebrate his life. He has lived his life to the fullest. At 97, that was life lived to the fullest and has played a significant role, which as a younger generation we must continue to celebrate and remember and honor through having greater African solidarity that will make all of us collectively prosper.
All right. Thank you so much. Floyd Shivambu is the EFF's second in command. We continue looking at the life, the works of Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, who passed away at the age of 97. Of course, we are still waiting for more details from the presidency in Zambia, but we do have our international news editor Sophie Mkwena with us in the studio. We've been playing in the background visuals of the role that Dr. Kaunda played in the unity of Africa, and that's something that you mentioned on Sophie. So let's continue those talks in the latter years after he'd already retired as a politician. His opinion was still much sought out in terms of establishing this United States of Africa.
Yes, many people did interact with him with the aim of drinking in this important well, because there was a lot of information they can get. And I think for young people in particular, as Floyd Shivambu has indicated, they must continue to research and to read about these leaders, because these are the leaders who played an important role in ensuring that today we are free, even though challenges are huge in terms of the economic emancipation. But they have done their part in terms of the political liberation. And therefore, the young crop must now focus on ensuring that they build a better Africa. And they must not wait for senior citizens to give them a mandate and direction in terms of what needs to be done to change the lives of the Africans on the continent. Africa is struggling, and only young people with vision, with education, who are very creative, can change the situation that we find ourselves in. And I remember the last time we did a proper story with him, it was during his birthday, when he turned 97. You know, he was willing, and he did send us a nice clip in terms of talking to us, to tell us his views at that time. And at that time, leaders such as the former President Thabo Mbeki, former President Jacob Zuma, former President Kgalema Motlanthe, and the current President Cyril Ramaphosa also issued statements wishing him well. And his children also spoke to us. I mean, he was very warm, and I think he has imparted the same skills and approach to his children in terms of how they interact with us. I mean, I spoke to his son, when was it? I think it was Monday, and he was willing to give me information, but he indicated that I must speak to the spokesperson of his office. And indeed, the spokesperson was available. So the relationship with us as a broadcaster was also very, very sound with the late KK Kaunda.
I want to take you back, Sophie, to 2013, where Dr. Kaunda's presence at former President Nelson Mandela's funeral was also one of the highlights. He managed to charm mourners there and bring to life the friendship that they had.
Yes, Tepiso, indeed he was there, and many people were very happy to see him. You know, he was Madiba's friend, and therefore him sharing his experience about Nelson Mandela was something that many people appreciated. But also during the time when the ANC turned 100 years, during the ANC centenary in Bloemfontein. In fact, these visuals, this is where he was. It was when the ANC turned 100 years in Bloemfontein, and the ANC was celebrating this centenary, where they had invited leaders from the continent, as you have perhaps picked up. President Paul Kagame, who was seated next to President Jacob Zuma. Thabo Mbeki, the former president, was also there. A nice environment, and he was there, and you could see him when he was going to the podium to speak, that he was so happy, you know, singing, celebrating. But he didn't forget his responsibility in terms of what he stood for. I mean, championing a stigma, fighting stigma against those who are infected or affected by HIV and AIDS. And therefore, he never retired. He continued to work in terms of advising people, but also making his voice heard in terms of issues that he was worried about.
Just a few days ago, Zambia's President Edgar Lungu had asked the nation, the world, in fact, to pray for Dr. Kenneth Kaunda. And unfortunately, his day has come. He said, may God touch him and may God heal him. And at the age of 97, he's lived a life that many say is worthwhile celebrating and will be celebrated for decades and lifetimes to come. We'll be back with more reaction and looking back at the legacy of Dr. Kenneth Kaunda.